Real quick before the video starts, I just want to mention that tcgplayer.com is doing a Cyber Monday sale starting at midnight Monday morning, so if you guys want to buy any of the cards that I mentioned in today's video, make sure to click the link in the description below. Yu-Gi-Oh! Obviously has a lot of different hand traps, some of which are not always good, but right now you can play a lot of different cards in your deck if you even want to play hand traps at all that are pretty effective against the current metagame. Cards like Ash Blossom are really popular obviously, and DD Crow has been on the rise as well, but one card that you might have seen pop up at YCS Pasadena in deck lists such as Dominic Couch's top 4 deck lists were 2 copies of Skullmeister in his main deck, and a couple other people played this card as well. I think Konami even featured it on the Konami blog talking about some of the hot text from the weekend, and Skullmeister is a very interesting card. So in today's video I want to talk about what makes Skullmeister so interesting and what separates it from cards like DD Crow and Ghost Belle and Haunted Mansion. Now all 3 of those cards do very similar things. I would say more so DD Crow and Skullmeister are very close. Ghost Belle covers a couple different areas, but all 3 of these cards affect things in the graveyard, or affect things that would affect the graveyard, and Skullmeister seems to be the most under the radar one of all 3 choices right now, but it still is topping tournaments. So in today's video I want to discuss what makes this card so cool. So what does Skullmeister do? Well, it is a level 4 Dark Fiend monster with 1700 attack points and 400 defense points, which means I guess in a pinch, if you wanted to, you could normal summon this thing, maybe attack over a monster, maybe make it rank 4 or something along those lines. Although obviously, like all hand traps, you're trying to actually keep them in the hand as a form of interruption. So what does its effect do? Well, it says when a card effect is activated in your opponent's graveyard, as a quick effect you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard to negate that effect. Keep in mind here, just like Ash Blossom, this card does not negate activations, it only negates effects. That might sound weird, or it might sound like it doesn't matter, but it does matter, because that means you cannot use Skullmeister in the damage step. What effect in the graveyard would activate during damage step? Well, there are certain cards, like if you attacked over an Altergeist Miluseek, you couldn't negate the searching ability. Same thing with Ash there in that case. And also if you attack over a Sky Striker monster and your opponent activates Ray in the graveyard, because this card does not negate activations, you can't actually use it during that sort of window, which means that you couldn't stop a Ray graveyard effect if it happened when you ran something over by battle. Of course, if you bounce something back or destroyed it with a card effect and then your opponent activated Ray, in those cases you could naturally use Skullmeister against that ability. But if you run over the monster in battle specifically, then you couldn't use Skullmeister. Just keep that in mind when we're talking about this card. But even with that downside, there still are quite a lot of cards you can negate with Skullmeister. So for example, you can negate pretty much any Orcus monster. They all have graveyard effects, as most of you probably already know. This is also very good against that Starliege deck, because Starliege's graveyard effect is super crucial for most of the combos. If your opponent banishes it for cost, you can just Skullmeister and stop that ability. Really strong stuff there. Also keep in mind that you can even use Skullmeister to negate spell and trap graveyard effects, which actually might be more useful than you think. If your opponent goes multi-roll and then sends their area space 0 to the graveyard to try to summon a Ray from the deck, you can simply negate it with Skullmeister, and in a lot of cases they don't have that Ray, or they don't already have that engage, that will severely impact how good their ending board is. Even if they have those other cards, usually they want that free Ray special summon, so by negating that you can actually do a lot of damage. But you might be asking yourself, how does this compare to DD Crow? Because right now DD Crow is by far way more popular, and probably in a lot of situations DD Crow actually is slightly better, but there are some very important and unique advantages to Skullmeister that DD Crow sometimes falls short on. So for example, one of the cool parts about Skullmeister is that you don't have to do it preemptively. In the case of DD Crow, for example, if your opponent like uses a danger monster and discards a Heart Pourer, you have to immediately use that DD Crow on the Heart Pourer to prevent your opponent from banishing it and special summoning a monster from their deck. However, with something like Skullmeister, you can actually wait until they use the Heart Pourer and then negate its effect, which means if they actually have a second copy and a way to get that in the graveyard, you don't have to worry about them using that copy. And this can be really tough sometimes, because if you let your opponent go for the Heart Pourer and then the Orchestrated Nightmare and then banish the Symbol Skeleton that they eventually get in the graveyard, while that still is pretty decent and you can save the DD Crow for that long, a lot of the times that's not actually that impactful, because by that point your opponent has summoned a Galatea and then gotten either a Babel or a Crescendo or a Return, whatever they actually needed, and sure, you cut them off from reviving something, but overall they still still got their engine going. So against Orcus, a lot of the times you want to cut them off before they actually get their engine going, but if you try to use DD Crow on that first Harp Horror that hits the graveyard, there is a small chance, maybe even more than a small chance, that your opponent will actually be able to get another copy in the graveyard without too much of a problem. Also keep in mind that DD Crow loses a lot of value if your opponent has an Orcus Babel face up on the field, because now all of their Orcus monsters are quick effects, and because you have to preemptively use that DD Crow, it pretty much becomes useless because now your opponent can just chain all their effects. And sure, you can still target whatever your opponent targeted with their Symbol Skeleton with the DD Crow, even if your opponent has a Babel face up on the field, but if your opponent has a Harp Horror or an Orcus Nightmare, no longer is DD Crow a decent counter if they have that Babel on the field, whereas something like Skullmeister actually still is pretty darn good against those cards because it doesn't care if they're quick effects because it waits until their effects are activated. And I'm not saying DD Crow is completely useless. The card is clearly very popular and very strong, but in those cases, Skullmeister actually might be better. Keep in mind here though that just because DD Crow might be better in more situations than Skullmeister doesn't mean that Skullmeister isn't going to be played. For example, in that deck list that I mentioned earlier, Dominic Couch's top 4 deck list at Pasadena, he not only played 2 Skullmeister, but he played them in addition to 3 copies of DD Crow. In that case, he clearly is playing the 2 copies of Skullmeister like a 4th and 5th copy of Crow, a card that he clearly thinks is very strong this format. The other card that you might compare to Skullmeister is Ghost Belle, and while I do think that's sort of okay because they both deal with negating graveyard effects as a hand trap, I feel like Ghost Belle is good and bad against a lot of different things than Skullmeister or DD Crow, because Ghost Belle is pretty good, don't get me wrong, but you're not going to Ghost Belle a Harp Horror, you're not going to Ghost Belle an Orcus Nightmare. While Ghost Belle is by far a more well-known card than Skullmeister, right now it's not really seeing too much competitive play. I mean, I think a lot of people are underrating Skullmeister, but it is still being played in tournament-topping deck lists from players that know it exists, whereas Ghost Belle is pretty much known by everyone and isn't really seeing a ton of success. Ghost Belle is better against certain matchups. I mean, for example, against Pure Thunder, Skullmeister and DD Crow, they don't do a lot, but Ghost Belle is super strong because you can negate the Hawk, and that is a huge deal and almost instantly wins you that game. So while Skullmeister, DD Crow, and Ghost Belle all can be used sometimes against the exact same cards, I feel like right now Ghost Belle has a lot of disadvantages, namely that it can't always negate graveyard effects. It can only negate effects that affect things in the graveyard. So I think right now the main debate is between DD Crow and Skullmeister, not so much Ghost Belle. So should you actually play Skullmeister? You know, I put out a lot of facts, I put out a lot of opinions, but should you actually play it in your Yu-Gi-Oh deck? Should you go out and buy this card? One of the things that you'll want to ask yourself before you pick up your copies of Skullmeister and put them into your deck, and bear with me here, it's going to sound a little bit obvious to some of you guys, is does my deck actually even play hand traps? Because if your deck prefers cards like Raw Sphere Mode or Dark Ruler No More or Evenly Matched to break boards and doesn't actually use any hand traps, well no, you don't need to add Skullmeister. It's not really the card that you want to have as your only hand trap in the entire deck. There are better options to fill that role. But if your deck actually already uses hand traps, and especially if you're already playing 2 or 3 copies of DD Crow, you want to ask yourself, do I really feel like DD Crow is so powerful that I'd want to play 4 or 5 copies of this card? Keep in mind here, not every deck is going to have the space for that, and namely right now would be like Orcus or Salamangreats or maybe Sky Strikers, although even Sky Strikers have sort of gone away from playing like a million hand traps. But if your deck is playing a lot of hand traps and you want to try something new out, I think Skullmeister is the perfect card to test. Besides what deck you're playing, you want to look at the metagame and you want to ask yourself, is there a deck out there right now that plays a really powerful hard once per turn graveyard effect that also has the ability, if necessary, to put multiple copies of it in the graveyard on the first turn? So right now I've used Harp Horror as an example, or Orcus Nightmare, any of the Orcus cards, because not only are those effects really powerful hard once per turns, but also that deck has a lot of ways to get those cards in the graveyard on the very first or even the second turn. If we think back to the last time that Skullmeister was really popular, it was at the 2017 World Championships, and the reason is that the 2 best decks that people predicted for that particular format were Dinosaurs as well as True Draco variants. And I say that because both of those decks lose really hard to Skullmeister. It was a really solid metagame choice for that one format. The Dinosaur deck has Miscellaneousaurus, a very powerful card that if it resolves can do an entire combo, and with Skullmeister you could just negate that without fear of them having another copy or a way to get another another copy in the graveyard. For True Dracos, you can negate all the spell and trap graveyard effects, which is one of the ways that that deck can actually break boards. So Skullmeister at that one event was really solid against the two expected meta strategies, and you can kind of see there why DD Crow wasn't very good for that event, because while DD Crow is okay against dinosaurs, a lot of the times they can just put that extra copy of Miscellaneousaurus in the graveyard and then just keep continuing on with their plays. Not to mention that DD Crow does nothing against any of the True Draco cards except for the trap card that revives during the end phase, but obviously it's not a very impactful way of using Skullmeister. So Skullmeister at that event was therefore way better than DD Crow, which is why it was by far one of the most popular hand traps at that year's World Championship. Like I said at the beginning of today's video, if you guys would like to purchase any of the cards that I talked about, whether or not that's Skullmeister or DD Crow or even Ghost Spell or whatever, make sure to use my link to tcplayer.com in the description below. You might want to wait until midnight though because of that Cyber Monday sale. I'm not sure when any of you guys will see this video, but if you're watching this on the Sunday that it was uploaded, you might want to wait just a few hours before making those purchases so you can get the deals on tcgplayer.com. Anyway though, I hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion video about Skullmeister. Let me know in the comment section below what you think about this card. Is it overrated? Is it underrated? Is it somewhere in between? I'll catch you in the next video though. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.